I would suggest we start, and as other participants will join us, they will be able to follow our discussion. First of all, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us today to our event. My name is Buril. I'm an electoral expert at the Expert Forum in Romania. Most of you I've just met through our recent discussions, although I knew your activity and your organizations from your activity, your previous activity. But now it's a pleasure to meet you face to face. Before starting, I would just like to talk to you a little bit about the purpose of the event, and why we organized it, and a few things about the situation in Romania. And I will also explain some administrative rules, let's say, of the meetings. But firstly, let me tell you about a little bit about Expert Forum and Each Vote Counts coalition, Fiecare Vot in Romanian, the coalition from which we are part of. Expert Forum is an organization which is based in Bucharest. We observe elections since 2014, and since 2016 we are part of Fiecare Vot coalition. And there are some other colleagues of mine here in discussion, including Maria Krause, who I see here, Cosmin Bârzan from Constanța. So there are also other colleagues in the country. Just to give you a number, in 2019, for the EU elections, we had around 1,300 observers. We do both long-term observation, but also focus on short-term observation with observers during the election day. And we are mostly based on volunteering. So most of our activity is based on volunteer work. To be more direct, we don't pay our observers, so it's an activity which is based on activity which is not remunerated. And what is the purpose of this meeting? First of all, I believe that during this current situation, observation may become a little bit more important due to the fact that in some countries there is a lack of transparency, or there are modifications to the legislation, to the practice, which might affect the let's say the integrity of the electoral process. This is the third meeting that we organized here in Romania. Actually, this is a more international meeting, but we already had two meetings in partnership with the IFES, and we also have today Mrs. Fernanda Buril, which will talk a little bit about their work. We organized a technical meeting with the Electoral Permanent Authority and the authorities who organize elections, one with the political parties, to see what's their vision on the elections. And this is the third meeting, and I think it covers a gap, because there were not too many discussions about the observation side of the elections. So we wanted to gather on one side organization who had experience, and maybe organization who will observe the elections later this year. Unfortunately, some of our colleagues that we invited were not available today, but at the end we would like to have at least a short policy brief with some conclusions and recommendations so that we can share for everybody. Let me just tell you a little bit of the situation in Romania. We should have had local elections in June, and they were postponed. I hope we will have them in September 27th. Although the situation with the number of COVID cases is getting higher, so there is a little bit of uncertainty if the election could really be organized in September. So far, and also we will probably have parliamentary elections in December. In winter, when probably the worst time to have elections in these current situations. There is a series of amendments to the legislation which apply to the specific elections. For example, political parties will be able to gather support signatures electronically. Just to give you an example, or the electoral administration will be able to use electronic signatures, and so there were some changes done. We don't have any new voting methods. I've seen that in many countries, and probably the most visible example was Poland. There were discussions about introducing postal voting or electronic voting. We had them, the discussions, and we even had some laws saying that in September we should vote electronically and by post. But at this point, we won't have any kind of special voting procedures just for the parliamentary elections, but we already have citizens from out of country can vote by post just this category of citizens. Also, I think that some other things that characterize the context is the fact that all the deadlines are much shorter. The electoral period was reduced. All the deadlines have been reduced to half. So practically everything is except for the campaign, the electoral campaign, and the period to get signatures. But otherwise, everything is much shorter, which might have an impact on everything. And other two things which are important, the fact that we vote just in one day. Although we don't expect a very high participation, we usually have 50% participation in local elections, which is not very high. Probably now we'll have even less. Although there is a recent poll about the intention to vote, and people say that we'll go to vote, but well, it's at this point it's hard to estimate, but probably we'll have lower participation. But there was a proposal to vote for 2 days, but unfortunately it was rejected in the parliament. So this could create quite, I don't know, crowds, or in some cases could create chaos in the polling stations. But let me also get to our thoughts and related to the observation of elections, and maybe you could take from here some questions that you might include in your presentations. So all the situation, we are now currently planning we are building our plan for the autumn and winter. And of course, we had to change our vision. Probably, first of all, we won't have 1,000 observers to go to the polling station. And this is natural because on one side, there is a fear of COVID. And on the other side, I think we will have to change our criteria of selecting observers, because there are some critical categories that you cannot credit due to health issues or other problems. And this is a question maybe for you to cover also in your presentations. Other things that we think that might be a little bit more difficult to observe, the electoral campaign, because everything probably, or a big part of it, will change to online. And even political parties that we talked to already told us that they are planning to move online. But there it's much harder to observe and also to see the financing part, because we also talk about money, not just about what's happening with the campaign, and of course the high risk of disinformation and fake news. The entire process and the reduction of the timelines practically will also probably have less mini changes, both from the government, from the parliament, from the electoral administration. So you'll have the rules set up as you go, which is bad for any process, that you don't have stability and you don't know what are the rules. Just to give you an example, for the local elections, political parties were not allowed to use subsidies, state subsidies, and a recent change will allow them to use. And the sums that political parties use for this kind of for subsidies are huge. Just to give you a figure, in 2018, around 37 million euros which is quite a big sum. So a few big political parties will come with a pile of money and will change the entire game. And this comes on a background in which the rules are changed not in a very transparent manner, in the sense that the parliament changes laws overnight, or and this might be problematic for us. Also, we think it might also be difficult to observe some of the changes which are related to COVID, as I was saying, for example, the electronic gathering of signatures. Of course, this is an alternative. You can also gather signatures on paper, but the electronic ones will be very difficult to monitor and to see who are those people who because you don't necessarily need a certified signature. Just the party needs to certify that the signatures are real, but otherwise you can get signatures from practically whoever you want. Also, another thing that we think it might be difficult is to monitor the activity of the electoral bodies. Unfortunately, in Romania, the work of the electoral administration of the commissions is not public anyway. But now it might be even a little bit more difficult to watch and to set up meetings, for example, with the political parties or institutions. Homebound voting. For special categories in Romania, you can use the ballot box. A special ballot box. I was saying we don't have postal voting, for example, for citizens who cannot go to vote. And I think it will be very difficult to go to a hospital or to a prison to observe this process. And it also might affect the transparency of the process itself, the fact that you have to keep distance and you cannot watch these procedures. And related to the E-Day, of course, I think the biggest problem is related to safety of observers. We will dedicate a lot of resources on one side on training, which will be probably online. We try to reduce any social contact that might be reduced. And we will have a special dedicated chapter in our manual for the observers. We want to make sure that they understand the risks. But I think it also depends on the discipline of voters and commissions, because we were joking a little bit with the colleagues and saying that if the members of the commission don't believe in COVID, leave the polling station, because it might be dangerous, you know. So it will also depend a lot of the environment, on small polling station, on crowded polling stations. So unfortunately, it may affect the accuracy of observation, but on the other side, we believe that the safety of observers is much more important than to stay in a polling station and be sick. Of course, it might be more difficult to observe the tabulation, for example, because you cannot get close to the ballots. Fortunately, in Romania, we have an electronic system which uses tablets. We use tablets in each polling station, and the tabulation is recorded. So practically, if you want to complain, you have the entire process is recorded, not the day of the election, just the tabulation. So you might have a proof afterwards if there was a fraud. I think, of course, that there is a long list of fears that we have and issues and things that we want to change, but I just wanted to highlight some of them. Of course, costs will be one of the issues, because the accreditation procedures or procuring some of the the health the health materials might be an issue. On the other side, the states, according to a law that was just passed, should provide, for example, with masks to observers, but we are not sure exactly how it will happen. So it will be learned by doing. But in this introduction, I just tried to highlight some of the things. Also, I just wanted to mention that there are some reports or researches that cover partially this issue of the monitoring. One is the report of IFES that Ms. Buril will talk about. ODIHR just released a report which covers partly this issue. So, but what we wanted from this debate is to hear from you who just passed from these experiences, and I will give you the floor. But before, in terms of administrative, let's say administrative setting, we have the question and answer section. So if any of the participants would like to ask questions, you can, or in the chat, everybody will see them. Or if you want to intervene after we finish with the first part of the introductory interventions, please let us know and we'll give you access to video and audio. We chose this kind of experience of webinar just to be a little bit more organized, because when there are a lot of people, you have a lot of noise. So it's just a thing that we wanted to control better the process. Also, this meeting is recorded and broadcast live on our Facebook, just to know also about this fact. So the agenda is split into let's say we have two introductory speeches from Mrs. Fernanda Buril and from Mr. Michael Lidauer, and afterwards we have three organizations from our region that will talk about their experiences, and the order is just a chronological one of the elections, let's say. So it was the criteria I found to be the most suitable. So without being too long, I will pass the floor to Ms. Buril, and my only request is just try to be to have a presentation of 10 minutes, the longest, if it's okay for you, please, so that we have time to discussions and question afterwards. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to participate in this conversation. Just to give a bit of background, since IFES is not a traditional observer organization, we've launched back in May a briefing series to tackle different topics, different concerns that we have on COVID-19 elections. So as part of this briefing series, we've been discussing electoral administration during COVID-19, infodemic, or how to maintain the accountability of institutions during states of emergency. So I had the pleasure of co-authoring the first paper in this briefing series, Safeguarding Health in Elections. It has been translated to 12 languages by now. And what it became was almost like a manual to help organizations plan and implement preventive measures. So I would like just to discuss a few of those considerations that we discuss in the paper. Not all of them are, of course, focused on observations and electoral observation, but we have a few considerations that are valid and apply to observer groups. So the first one, I think, and you already mentioned that, Septimius, is about the presence of observers in the first place, right? Because we face kind of a dilemma right now. We want observers, we want more people there to scrutinize and to make the process more transparent, especially in situations where there are political tensions or there are new procedures that people must be aware of and we must report on. So we do want observers in polling stations, but at the same time, we do want fewer people in the polling stations at the same time, right? To reduce the problem of conglomerations, to allow for better social distancing. So that's one of the first issues there, how to calibrate these two needs, of the need of having observers and the need to protect observers and to reduce the number of them in polling stations. So there one is to train observers and poll watchers. So even though we might have fewer observers, the recommendation is that we train more people. Because the day of elections, we can have dropouts, we can have people unfortunately falling sick or caring for people who are sick. We might have people who are just too afraid of actually participating, right? So we might have more dropouts, so we might want more people actually trained to replace those. There are things you also mentioned already, but paying special attention to people in the at-risk groups, right? So the elderly, people with serious medical conditions or chronic diseases. Of course, we do not want to exclude them from participating in observation or as a poll worker, but it's only fair that those additional risks that they face are made very clear, and that at a minimum, they are given all the personal protective equipment and training and information that they need to protect themselves. So there's also this issue actually of at-risk groups being, at a higher risk, of course, of getting severe illness from COVID-19. This is a good reason to make more efforts to recruit more young people as observers, not only as observers, but also as poll workers, as poll watchers. So having this effort to make more young people participate in this process. Of course, young people are not immune to the disease, but they are at a lower risk of getting severely ill from it. So it's beneficial for the sake of getting more youth to participate, but also from the health perspective. And of course, regardless of at-risk groups or low-risk groups, the training is very important, right? So for the training of those observers, there are at least two things to consider. One, they must be very aware and very well informed about any kind of new procedure. So if, for example, the voter identification or the voter verification changes, right? So instead of giving your voter ID to the poll worker, you just show it from a distance. Observers who are not aware, they might think that there's something going on, right? So they must be very aware of the whole protocol for voting according to the new preventive measures. So that's one of the points. The second one is that the training should also incorporate the preventive measures themselves and how the observers should comply with them, right? So it's very important that they know how to wear masks, how to wear protective equipment if they are given other protective equipment like gloves or gowns, right? So they should know very well how to use them properly to protect themselves and to protect others. And in terms of compliance, I think it's also important to notice that observers are almost like role models to you, right? So they must comply with those measures, not only, yes, for themselves, but also for the voters who are there, for poll workers. And I was lucky to be able to participate, to go to Belgrade last month to observe the election. And I don't know how many times I heard that, but when we were at some polling stations visiting, we heard the poll worker telling people in line, oh no, you have to put a mask on because we have observers inside, right? So that observer effect. Unfortunately, that's not what we want. We want people to comply with the measure because it's the right thing to do. It's the safest thing to do. But that is real, right? The observer effect is real. So if people know that somebody's watching, they're more likely to comply with those measures. And let me see what else I had here just as a main thing to discuss. And so, yeah, for all of this to be more successful, for the preventive measures to be complied with, right, it's very helpful to, like in an ideal world, for observer organizations to have the opportunity to provide inputs, right? So in the beginning of the process, many countries are doing some joint task forces, right? Including people, stakeholders from different areas, so they can provide inputs, so they can, the Election Commission can hear what the concerns are and how to tackle those concerns, how to address those concerns, so everybody feels comfortable and confident in participating in the electoral process in a safe manner. So if observers can have the opportunity to participate in this conversation from the beginning, to provide inputs and to be aware of what the preventive measures will be, that also helps a lot on election day and on the day of electoral activity. So, they're more comfortable with the procedures already, and they're able to comply with them. So those were just my initial thoughts, and I'll be happy to come back and respond to any questions you guys might have.
Thank you very much. Actually, you underlined some very important point about the collaboration, and also one of our key elements in the strategy was to try to speak to the electoral authorities, to the government, to the parliament, because otherwise, in this context, maybe sometimes authorities do not understand very clearly the role of the observers, and see them as a burden or something. Don't understand the need to protect them and all this kind of things. So fortunately, we had a good discussion here in Romania about these topics. But I think very well underline the fact that our role is also to offer our view and to offer our expertise in this complicated context. So thank you very much. We also have we already actually have a question, and maybe some of the other speakers could answer. Would you be able to talk about the differences you perceive between observation by domestic groups and international groups of OSSE? So I will pass the floor to Michael Lidauer. If you can hear us.
Yes, I can hear you very well. Most of the video in between, just to make sure the connection is stable. And I hope it will help now. Please make me aware if it doesn't. Yeah, are we okay with this?
So far it's okay. So if there are problems, I will let you know.
All right, excellent. Yeah. So first of all, thank you very much for the kind invitation for this online workshop today. We are very glad to participate alongside IFES and others. We are also very happy to see again several colleagues who have participated in the Election-Watch.EU record assessment earlier in the year, like Sophia and Maria. I'm also happy to meet new colleagues, in particular from Most and CRTA.
So, well, I think we could try without the video
talk and short input today. Yes.
Sorry, I will have. Sorry, I think we can try without the video because it's lagging a little bit too much, and it worked better without the video.
Okay, I would now switch to a PowerPoint presentation. We can try if the screen sharing works. And if you see after 1 or 2 slides, then it doesn't, then I will use it without the visual transmission. Would that be okay for you, Septimius?
Yes, sure.
Okay, so let's try. It said the host disabled attendee screen sharing.
Just a second. Yes, well, try now.
Okay, I'll try again. Yeah, okay. Just a second. Now it should work. So I think you should see the slide now.
No, I think it's loading.
Do you?
Yes, now, yes.
Okay. Okay, so let me start from here. Yeah, I would like to briefly introduce the work of Election-Watch.EU and what we've done in Europe over the last couple of years as a network before I explain our rapid assessment on COVID-19 and election in Europe, which we did in April this year. as an organization. We originated in Austria in 2013. Unlike many other domestic observer organizations, we instance for elections globally and assembled experience there before actually bringing it back home to Austria and looking what we can do in our own country, in Europe, around electoral reforms. In Austria, we have
could you try stopping the
still
video,
have a situation
because
where election observation is limited in the law. It is allowed and foreseen for so I will stop to share the video now.
Maybe the video. I think the video it's.
I will stop to share the video now, and we'll just continue speaking. Can you hear me well?
Yes. Please, it might work a little bit better.
Can you hear me, Septimius?
Yes. Is
it off now?
Yes, it's
okay. So let's try. I'm sorry for that. Yeah, let's try like this. So basically, in Austria, we have a situation where election observation is only possible for internet. For try to pitch our advocacy in Austria as electoral reform advocacy.
Unfortunately,
we reform group, and
not
case, but we had a major electoral crisis. Oh God. Okay. I must say I've tested this before.
Okay, so let's try, but it's a little bit interrupted. But let's try that.
Okay, so I will try to speak slowly. Yeah. Around 2016, we had an electoral crisis back in Austria. Since then, the possibilities and interest in citizen election observation really grew in Austria since then. And we had the chance to present a catalog of election reform proposals to the Austrian Parliament, started to work around citizenship education, and also joined the global network of domestic election observers from that perspective. When it came to the European election, to go to the European Brussels to assess election assessment mission at European level, and after that organized an election assessment mission to the European elections 2019, covering all EU member states, involving about 65 people and 8 like-minded organizations. There was no specific focus on election day, but an overall focus on specific aspects of the legal framework in a comparative manner. The report of which was released in September last year. It was meanwhile presented at the European Commission, at the European Parliament, and is subject to electoral reform on the future of Europe. So the rapid assessment that we conducted on COVID-19 and elections earlier in this year, we were contacted by the European Commission earlier in the year, and with the question whether our network would be engaging in any activities to assess the impact of COVID-19 on elections in Europe at that time. And this is what we did. Can I just check in between if you can still hear me and if you can follow me?
Yeah, sure.
Very well. Okay, so what we did based on the work of last year, what we did this year was to conduct a rapid assessment across 27 EU member states, plus Albania, North Macedonia, and the UK, bringing together around 55 people from across Europe to understand how COVID-19 might affect elections, electoral planning, and related legislation in Europe. The idea was really to take a snapshot of what is happening in the European Union, and a bit broader than that, to understand how the lockdown affects the election. To illustrate what's happening, I can try to switch on the screen, but maybe that is not prepared slides, and share the infographics to it later on. We could see that first of all, the question was, where were also among the first questions that were starting to be answered by IFES and international IDEA at that time. Within the European Union, we could see that at Europe went into the lockdown, only France and Germany went ahead with some kind of elections at that time, and others got postponed. In France, the first round of the municipal elections took place. The second round was postponed, took place recently. In Germany, the second round of local elections in Bavaria still took place, but there it went to postal voting only, and actually the turnout even rose. Still foreseen at the time of our assessment, but later was postponed, was the election in the presidential elections in Poland, and Sophia will be able to talk much more profoundly about this. We could see that a whole number of elections, at national elections, regional elections, local elections, and referenda were postponed across Europe. Some took place in the meanwhile, such as in France and in Poland. Others are yet to come. Another election that was postponed but took place in the meanwhile were the local elections in the Basque country and in Galicia in Spain last weekend. Now, what happened here? We could see that in about 6 countries within our sample, the legislative changes that were undertaken at that time had some kind of effect on the longer electoral cycle. In 13 different countries, the legislation had some effect on elections in one way or the other. In most cases, this was specific legislation to actually postpone elections, even at the local level. Not many countries actually had legislation in place to be able to do that, but had to pass legislation like this. The other kind of legislation passed was enabling new conditions, new voting methodologies or safety measures to safeguard the polls. But what was a really interesting finding and outcome of our rapid assessment is how parliaments adjusted to this new lockdown situation in very different ways. Some parliaments started to continue to convene in person. Other parliaments reduced the convening in person by numbers. Not all parliamentarians actually went to sessions. Other parliaments suspended their sessions partly or entirely, and few parliaments moved their activities online. But all in all, showing a great mix of responses to the COVID-19 situation. In North Macedonia, Parliament was suspended for some time, but reconvened after some time again. In 2 countries in our sample, in Germany and in Sweden, respectively, there was actually a change to parliamentary quorum for parliamentary decision-making. One of the questions that was interesting to see, and was also partly discussed in the public domain, was whether there would be a partial or full state of emergency in place to regulate parliamentary decision-making with effects on elections during that time. And one of the interesting outcomes of this short assessment was that not all countries actually have such emergency legislation. And in some countries, emergency legislation is graded according to different types of emergency. And that would require more research to see how colorful and how differentiated the picture in this field actually is. Legislation and the lack of existing legislation for election postponements. Several countries like Austria, like Germany, like Croatia, like Slovenia, Greece, and others, they introduce new legal measures to actually deal with the legal framework. A little side element of that rapid assessment was that we could see there was an extremely dynamic debate about whether mobile phone apps to monitor citizens' movement, to monitor contact tracing emerged often together with the debates whether elections should be held or not. And that also found an extremely
Michael, can you hear us?
Dynamic situation.
Sorry, but I have the Ingrid task to ask you to
change very quickly across Europe.
Sorry, Michael, I have the Ingrid task to ask you to approach the end of your presentation, and maybe we can touch upon some of the things in the second part. So if you may, can you hear me? So I was just saying that I have the Ingrid task to ask you to approach the end of your presentation, and so that we can move forward, please. And we'll get to some of these issues at the next section. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Septimius. I just wanted to come to the end of my presentation. Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize how extremely dynamic the situation across Europe was, and the need for observation in that field. And with that, we are currently contemplating a longer-term research project where we would like to follow a number of COVID-19 electoral processes beyond election day for about a year. And we will be happy to discuss this proposal further. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much for the presentation of your research. We can also send it at the end, or we can send a link, or you can even put it in the chat, the link to the results of the presentation.
I can try to do that. I'm sorry for the connection problems.
Well, no problem.
Questions later on.
I think this is one of the risks when using technology, but on the other side, you know, we can gather a lot of people from a lot of countries, so this is the good side. But of course, there might be issues from time to time. So I will pass the floor, and I hope I will read your name correctly, Mr. Vujo Ilić. From Centar for Research, Transparency and Accountability from Serbia. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Septimius, and thanks everybody for joining us today. So I'll try to just describe what we did, and then hopefully we can continue the discussion later. So as you already mentioned, so Serbia was the first European country to hold general elections after or during the pandemic, actually. And also the first country to experience riots. The state managed the elections and epidemic, but that's another topic maybe. So we were also thinking very hard how to proceed with the election observation. The manuals of IFES that Fernanda mentioned and other resources were extremely useful, because we basically always had to balance between the need to observe and to protect the observers. And that's something that's basically the main theme of what I'm talking about today. The election period was cut by the state of emergency, introduced in mid-March. And when it continued, we had to adapt because the virus was still not gone. So the main thing I guess I want to talk about is the online training of observers, because I think we made the biggest progress there, and maybe it's something that other observation missions could use in the future. But let me first actually introduce CRTA. That's a short version of what you just said, the 5 words name of our organization. We've been active for more than 10 years, but this is our 5th year of election observation. We started monitoring in 2016 with the general elections, continued 2017 with presidential elections, then 2018-19 with local elections, and then this year with again general elections. We're of course members of GMDM and NMO and other affiliations of civic observation organizations. So I guess with many other organizations, we started with monitoring the election day and then expanded our operation when we realized that there are many more dimensions that we were missing if we focus only on the election day. So in 2020, we were, besides monitoring the election bodies, we also monitored the media, we monitored the social media, we monitored the long-term campaign and the election day. And LTO observation we designed this year as observers making rounds in all settlements above 1,000 people in Serbia. For the election day, we again expanded our operation there too. We had a stratified representative sample of 500 polling stations with 2 shifts, but also we monitored what was happening outside of the polling stations and voting from home on smaller subsamples. And I think this is really important with what was happening during the pandemic. In total, we had 1,700 observers. And I will skip the question. Maybe we can return to the question of the relation between domestic and international observers, because I think it's actually important, but I will leave it for the Q&A. So elections were called in early March for April, delayed after less than 2 weeks with the state of emergency. So everything was frozen and continued 50 days later. What we did as an election observation mission was that we continued with media and social media monitoring, of course, and we gathered precious information there. The long-term observation we had to completely freeze for the duration of the state of emergency. But even when we continued after the state of emergency, we continued with a lighter footprint than before. So instead of making, for instance, 2 weeks rounds from in all the settlements gathering information, we just prolonged it into 3 weeks. So they had to do basically less reiterations of the observation. The main challenge, I think, was how to organize the short-term or election day observation trainings. We had to train around 1,700 observers. And usually what we did in the previous years is that we had trainers working in all regions of Serbia with smaller groups. During the state of emergency, we realized that this had to be moved online as the travel and gatherings presented the risk of spreading the virus. And I think it also had special weight this year because as we expanded our operation, we also had around 3/4 of all observers that were first-time observers. So they needed to be trained properly. So we decided to move it online. It took around a month to prepare an online education and testing tool. What we did is that we took the whole electoral process, divided it in 9 modules with 3 to 6 units, around 40 units in total. And the units were audio-visual lectures, which were subtitled, explanations of the process. And each module was followed by a test. We put a 80% threshold for stepping up to the next module. And in the end, there was the final exam with, again, 80% of correct answers required to pass. And as we saw at the election day, the quality of what we received from the observers did not suffer at all because of this. And we are starting to think that it also actually improved the way that they observe. And I think there are two reasons for this, which are basically two main benefits of moving to online training. One is that having real-time testing allowed us to assess the ability of observers to process this information. And we could immediately seek replacements for the observers that would either not log in or maybe, fail the test or start the test and never finished it. We just knew that we need to replace this observer with new observers. So it gave us precious time to actually intervene in the process, which is much harder when we have the physical trainings. And the second is that as a lot of people were isolated, perhaps in their country houses or in their homes, they could do the test whenever they wanted. They could organize their own time and work when they could find time, and even revisit the materials if they forgot something. And we got a lot of this feedback that it was actually useful for them to go back to model 3 and see, for instance, what is the proper arrangements of the polling board members if they forgot something. And of course, the third benefit of the online training is that it was just incredibly resource saving. We assessed that the online training replaced around 90 or even perhaps around 100 physical trainings that our trainers had to do in all the regions. And I mean, we didn't calculate how much time, resources, liters of gas and, everything was saved by this. But I'm quite sure that it was really resource saving for one. And I also think that basically, when we look at this overall, I think we would not be able to monitor these elections if we did not switch to an online tool. It was basically impossible to do all of this during the pandemic. I think it will be a valuable resource in the future, and we will certainly now continue to use it. And I'm saying all of this because if there is any way that we can share some of these insights with other organizations, we are really more than happy to share in much more detail. What we noticed is that we underestimated the need for technical support, in a sense that logging in, having different glitches in the system, we underestimated how much people needed to work on this. And also, it was kind of interesting that a lot of people were also calling technical support when they didn't know the answers at the test. So it was kind of, we need to make sure this is the support for technical, and this is the support when you don't understand something. So regarding the election day on June 21st, of course, it was a low turnout. It was a historically low turnout with 49% in the end. There were two institutional changes that were related to the pandemic. Of course, I'm not going into the whole electoral engineering part of these elections because it was a really politically very charged election in Serbia due to the boycott. So I'm not mentioning a lot of changes that happened in January, February, with lowering the threshold, with different rules. I'm just talking about the institutional changes which were related to the answer to the pandemic. As you also already mentioned, Septimius, there was also a change of support signature collection, but not moving it to the online, but actually instead of using public notaries or sort of like courts, party lists were allowed to collect signatures in the municipal administrations, which we think made the process less transparent actually, and less and more prone to local government influence than what we think should be the case. So our aim would be to advocate for this to move back to the public notary or to the court system. And the other change that was done was that voting from home was incentivized by explicitly calling for voters that are not able to go to the polling stations to vote from home, and the application was prolonged. Usually, or before these elections, it was enough to send somebody to the polling station on the day of elections before 11 a.m. and then the polling board would form a committee that would go to the home of the voter for the voting. And now it was prolonged in the sense that voters could apply either through phone or through email 2 days in advance. Regarding the use of protection during protective gears, so to say, the Central Electoral Commission issued instructions only 5 days before the elections, and we assess this as really too late for the process. The instructions were good; they were just really too late. They mandated the use of masks and gloves, as well as maintaining the distance, which was mandatory for polling board members and only recommended for the voters. The rules that applied to the board members applied to observers too. And of course, we already planned all of this. We had the masks and everything, and we instructed our observers how to behave to minimize the chances of being infected or getting other people infected. But if we only listened to if we didn't plan this in advance and relied on the Electoral Commission, we could not be able to actually have this in time. So it was not a good practice, actually. Our observers were able to monitor the compliance at the polling station to these rules, and as Fernanda was already saying, I mean, we cannot discount the observer effect. The fact that our observers were there probably influenced, and so this should be understood as the maximum rather than a minimum compliance. But around 3/4 of polling board members were completely following the rules, and around half of the voters were using the protection throughout the day. But this actually, we also noticed a fatigue. In the morning hours and in the early afternoon, there was higher compliance with the rules, and then it started dropping towards the end of the day. So you could also see how this fatigue affected the way that the polling day was organized. Voting from home was doubled, as we expected. It was around 3% of all voters that voted from home, from 1.5% previous years, and it also followed a similar pattern as voting at the polling stations. So, just to basically wrap it up with what happened after the election day, epidemiological situation worsened following the elections. I mean, we cannot claim any causal effect, but it's almost impossible to say that the campaign that was happening did not, and the easing up of the rules did not partially contribute to this. The Central Electoral Commission decided to organize a revote on more than 200 polling stations, which was again unprecedented. We never had so many polling stations having a revote on July 1st. And this is where we had to step back and say that we cannot observe this. We were primarily motivated by the safety of observers. Among these 200 polling stations, maybe 1/4 or even more was in the municipalities which were already becoming a hotspots of the second peak of the first wave of the pandemic, and we just could not risk sending our observers anymore there. Turnout was also drastically lower, but so this is basically how the election process turned out. It's still ongoing. I mean, there are still some of the election of the election rights protection processes are still ongoing in front of the courts. We're still observing what is happening, but this is pretty much it. So just to sum up, it was really a challenging process. I think what we did with the voter with the observer training was really a good job. We're really satisfied with this, and I think we're not going back to physical training. And again, this balance between the need to really observe as much as we can and to protect the voter, but we maybe went on the side of observing more than we should. In hindsight, maybe we could have dropped some of these elements, but again, we were operating at the period where the official data that we were getting was telling us that there was no cause for such big concern. Our observers were feeling confident. We were in direct communication with them. They felt confident. We also relied on this. At the moment when we got their feedback for the revote, that they're not feeling safe enough to participate, this was also a very important thing for us. We realized we cannot put them in jeopardy, and we need to step back from observing the revote. So there is a couple of more things that I wanted to mention, but maybe let's leave it for the Q&A. And thank you again for inviting us to this webinar, and I'm looking forward to other contributions.
Thank you very much for your input. We might ask you more details about the training platform. So this is a very interesting topic, and also I would put on the list of questions for you and the next speakers. Maybe we can talk about it in the second part on what other technological tools maybe you included in the elections, and but maybe I will also put these questions to our next speaker, Mrs. Zofia Rutkiewicz. I hope I pronounced it well, which is Vice President for Political Accountability Foundation, and will tell us more about the Polish case. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. So before I move to the election observation and election day part of my presentation, I wanted to talk about how Poland approached this election, because we're a bit of a special case when it comes to how we handled the election during COVID-19. So as some of you might know, we had an election scheduled for May 10th. It was a presidential election that was scheduled before the pandemic actually hit, before it was present in Poland. So once we started having COVID-19 cases, there was a big discussion between the political forces how we should proceed with the election, what should be done. The government has decided to introduce a state of epidemic, which, as Michael mentioned before, we have those different states of emergency, some of which are not really a state of emergency. So in the Polish case, the state of epidemic is not an official state of emergency, so it does not have any impact on the date of the election. So the election was not postponed; it was still scheduled for May 10th. So the discussion continued as to how to handle the election. There was an idea to do it completely by postal voting. And one thing you should know is that Poland does not have a good experience with postal voting, meaning that basically in all previous elections, it was only limited to people with disabilities. So we do not have experience running postal voting for a large number of people. So this was quite controversial. Introducing a completely new way of voting in such a short amount of time, especially given that the Polish Post is not actually famous for being a reliable service. So people were also questioning basically the state's ability to carry out this election. So actually the legislation introducing postal voting was only introduced because of a very long debate in the parliament. It only entered into force on May 9th, so a day before the election. This is why we had quite a turbulent week before the election day, and on May 7th, so 3 days before the election, the National Election Commission actually stated that it's impossible to carry out these elections, and that polling stations will simply not open on May 10th. So when the new bill on postal voting was introduced on May 9th, I mean, we had this situation when technically there was a postal voting election supposed to happen, but there were no ballots printed, no ballots sent to anyone. So the election simply did not take place, which is quite, I think, an unusual situation. And I'm not aware of any precedents of this happening. So on the 10th of May, the NEC basically stated really that there was no possibility to vote and that we have to have another election. So a new election was announced for June 28th. And there was a new legislation because the parliament has backtracked on this idea of having the election completely via postal voting. So on June 2nd, we had a new bill introducing a hybrid voting system, so people could choose whether they want to vote in person in polling stations or by post. And the atmosphere within the country and also the actions of the government were basically pointing towards a situation where COVID-19 is not portrayed as a big issue anymore. So the situation was normalized. A lot of the requirements and the restrictions that have been introduced before have been canceled. And because of that, actually not a big amount of people signed up for postal voting. So it's below 1% of all voters in Poland. So even though this new way of voting was introduced, it was not actually used by a huge majority of people within the country. However, it was very popular outside of Poland because we have quite a big diaspora, and in countries such as the UK or Germany or the US, Poles who wanted to vote, they had to vote by mail. So we have actually a bigger number of people voting by mail abroad than in Poland itself. So, well, there is a lot of questions around this, how this new election was carried out, but it's a bit of a legal issue, so maybe I will not get into too much detail here. However, this new bill on hybrid voting also contained a provision where in those municipalities where the rate of COVID was quite high, the Ministry of Health could suggest that elections should happen only by postal voting. And the week before the first round, it was announced that there will be 2 municipalities that will only vote by mail. And then there was another regulation by the Ministry of Health that limited the number of people in polling stations to 1 person per 4 square meters. And this caused well, a lot of trouble for the poll workers who had to actually count the surface area of their polling stations and to estimate how many people they can accommodate at a certain time. However, this actually, in our assessment, solves a couple of issues in terms of especially like polling places being too crowded or people not really observing the secrecy of the vote, which is a big issue in Poland. So having less people in a polling station at a time actually helped with that. One thing we as an organization managed to do was we did a bit of advocacy, basically, so that domestic observers and international observers and candidate proxies could be kind of taken out of this 1 person per 4 square meter limit. It's a bit controversial because in a way you don't want to have too many people in a polling station. However, at the time there have been basically, well, there was a possibility that this particular regulation would be used to limit the presence of observers within the polling station. So we advocated that observers are taken out of this limit so that we're not anyway limited in our work. Another interesting regulation in terms of how voting was organized, and it was only introduced before the second round. So the Ministry of Health issued another regulation saying that because there was a lot of long queues forming outside of the polling station. So ahead of the second round, certain categories of people had priority in terms of when they could enter the polling station. So elderly people, people above 60, pregnant women, people with children, they all had priority in terms of when they could enter the polling station. Yeah, one thing that was mentioned before, we tried to advocate for the state to supply personal protective equipment for observers. However, we did not manage to do so. So unfortunately, we decided to, well, we were in no position to supply personal protective equipment for our observers because of logistical reasons, which I would cover soon. But what we decided to do for this specific question, we consulted a medical professional who prepared a set of guidelines for us and for our observers. So we kind of had this expertise on how observers should handle themselves, how often they should basically switch their gloves and masks, and how many coverings they should have for an entire day and night of work. So we were very happy to do that, and our observers also, from the feedback that we got from them, they were quite happy that they had this kind of certified medical opinion, and that we were just not basically winging it. But we had an expert who confirmed those guidelines. So in terms of election observation, one thing that you should know is that it's quite new in Poland. It was only introduced in 2018. So we're doing quite a lot of work to make it something that's more popular. And I think a lot of factors around this particular election meant that observation is becoming more and more popular. So in terms of the May 10th election, we were actually preparing to observe this election before it got, well, not canceled, but before it didn't happen. So there was quite a high interest in observation back then, because people were quite angry in terms on how the electoral process was being conducted and on this entire mess in terms of the way of voting. However, a lot of people were also very cautious about COVID. So for the first round of the election, so before June 28th, in our assessment, the interest in election observation was actually not quite high. This is the beginning of the holiday period in Poland. So in general, people are not really that keen on contributing an entire day and night of their holidays to observe the election. So for the first round, we only had 70 observers. However, because there have been quite a lot of media publications about irregularities during the first round of the election, and also because the difference between the two candidates has been incredibly small between, well, they were basically predicted to have 50% each. So the interest in in election observation activities grew quite dramatically, and both in terms of actually election observers, but also candidate proxies. So we had a lot of people who signed up for either of them, and we had our organization, we had around 250 people across Poland, and as well in polling stations abroad. So we observed in the US and Germany, UK, and a couple of other countries in Europe, which was also a very interesting exercise, given that only postal voting was basically allowed in most of those countries. In terms of training, as it was said, we basically discovered online training for this particular election. We actually started preparing our online observation course before the pandemic started, so it wasn't our plan for this year. But then things got interesting, so we're basically really thankful that we've managed to create a full online course. It takes about 4 hours to go through it, and it really helped us to recruit people from all over Poland, and also people who are abroad. So I mean, it would normally be impossible for us to train someone who's in Washington, DC. However, with this online course, we've managed to do so. So we've managed to train around 350 people, which is quite impressive for Polish standards. We also did an additional training, which we taped, and it was specifically focused around health and safety and logistics, to kind of have this additional bit of information and some kind of a checklist for observers before election day. In terms of other technical tools, we were using a mobile app to collect data from our observers. So it's a long-standing partnership with another Polish organization, the Państwo Foundation, who has developed a mobile app for us. So we've managed to minimize paper and this kind of exchange of other virus-prone surfaces. In terms of the methodology, we usually follow the OSCE methodology, and we send people in teams of 2. This time round, we decided not to do that. We only allowed those people who either are in close contact or who live together to observe in teams of 2. Others were observing as single observers, which was quite complicated because many of them were actually observing for the first time, but we didn't want to put them in a car with someone who they don't know, to drive around for 24 hours in this pandemic time. So this is one thing that we did in terms of the change in methodology, and also this had an impact on the deployment that we prepared, because a lot of people were not really keen on driving too far away from home in this complicated time. So a lot of our observers were centered around bigger cities, unfortunately. But these are kind of the sacrifices that we made in terms of maintaining this high level of observers and trying to kind of also address their concerns in terms of the observation activity and how the day will proceed. And obviously, we did not focus this much on observing as many polling stations during the day as we would like to. We rather told our observers that they should take breaks. They should observe like 4 to 6 packs per day, and just care more about their health and safety, and taking a break for lunch, dinner, sleep, and focusing more on counting, because counting was the key for this particular election, with many irregularities observed during the first round. In terms of international observers, there was a very limited presence of observers in Poland. There was an odd-year mission. However, it was only made up of experts. So basically only the core team was present, and they did a very limited E-Day observation effort. There was also a Council of Europe mission. And as far as I'm aware, these were the only people present. In terms of legislation, I mean, international observers have a bit more rights than domestic observers actually in Poland. But because of the pandemic situation, not a lot of groups decided to actually come to Poland for this particular election. So yeah, to conclude, I mean, we're happy that this was a very emotional election, and this caused a lot of people to be drawn to election monitoring, be it through domestic observation or through being candidate proxies. So we're quite happy about that. This election was also characterized by a very high turnout, 68%, which is very high for Poland, the second highest since 1989. In a way, you can see that COVID has done a lot of damage to our election system, especially in terms of the trust and the stability of the system, because of those legal changes that were introduced in April and May and then June, which turned the election upside down for quite a long period of time. However, basically, if you look at the elections and the first and the second round, so end of June, beginning of July, COVID didn't really have that much of an impact in terms of how the public conducted itself. It had more of an impact in terms of the voting process itself, and us as observers and our ability to have a big observation mission and to follow all of the OSCE standards. And I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your intervention, and we picked up some very interesting things from it, including the use of the app. And after the last presentation, maybe we can go to the discussion of forms and how you managed to get information from the observers. We also got an interesting question related to this is actually for CRTA. If it was possible to follow the voting from home, including by person in self-isolation and those diagnosed with COVID-19 in a systematic manner. Were there any additional health protective measures put in place by the electoral administration from homebound voting for voters that were known to be in self-isolation or infected? Actually, this is a good question for everybody. And I will pass the floor to Mr. Zlatko Dimitrievski from MOST in North Macedonia. Of course, you have a lot of questions apart from your presentation. You have a lot of questions. If you want to answer to any of them, please feel free to include them in your speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Septimius. It's a pleasure to address this panel. Just a question: do you hear me well? Is the audio okay?
Yes, it's okay. Thank you.
It's a pleasure, as I said, to address you. It's very convenient for these online events to have participants and attendees from all around the world. I have prepared a PowerPoint, so I will now share the screen. Can you please allow me?
It should work now.
Yep, just a second. Okay. So I will talk about the election process, both from the institutional perspective, how the institutions and all the legal challenges were dealt with, and then I will turn to how we did manage to cope with everything, and how did we observe the process regarding considering all the challenges posed by COVID-19. In the beginning, just a quick intro about the organization. We are established in 2002. And have monitored all national and elections and referenda since. We are the oldest, most comprehensive domestic observer, and we engaged the highest number of observers. Most comprehensive meaning we observe the whole process, the entire process, from the announcement of the elections until the publication of the final results. We deploy LTOs. We have static STOs, which are at one polling station for the entire day. We have, in addition, mobile teams, which are similar to the international observers. They are going to polling stations which we don't have observers on, and are monitoring the atmosphere around the polling stations for potential vote buying, etc. And we also observe the municipal election commissions and the state election commission, both during the process and on election day as well. The elections were announced on 15th of February. Then they were scheduled for 12th of April, but similar to the Serbia case, on 18th of March, the president introduced a state of emergency, since this is actually the prerogative of the parliament, but the parliament was dissolved and it could not convene again because that's the law. And in that case, the president is entitled to do this. And on 21st of March, the government suspended the election process with a government decree, which has a force of a law in a state of emergency. But all the actions started taken until that day remained valid, which means that actually the process was frozen and will be unfrozen when the state of emergency would end. At that stage, practically all of the preparations for the election process took place. The voter registration was completed, and the public inspection in the voter list was completed. The registration of the candidates was completed. So the only thing that remained to be conducted was the election campaign. So it was a very convenient moment to to stop and to suspend the process. After the state of emergency ended, the elections continued on 23rd of June and were set for the 15th of July. In retrospective speaking, maybe it was better to have them on 12th of April, but at that time, on 13th of or 18th of March, nobody knew how to cope with the virus. There were no safety recommendations and precautions, and now after we learned about the virus, something about the virus, and we could foresee how the epidemiological picture will take place, and then it was better maybe to have them delayed. There was some political bargaining about the date, because they should have been first for 21st of June, but then there was some political bargaining, and the political parties then finally agreed on 15th of July, which is not new in our case, the political parties to have some political bargaining regardless of all the legal or whatever consideraments. I will speak general about the process, how it was modified with the COVID. For example, after the suspension of the election, the question of voters registration appeared. For example, the people who will turn 18 between the two election dates and the people who will die in that period. So the voters list was updated with a critical date of 15th of July, just to take into consideration all of the changes, but there was no opportunity for citizens to challenge this. There was no public inspection after the election process continued, because simply there was no time for this. Submission of candidates list was done. There was also opportunity for to be done electronically, both in person and electronically. The campaign was also modified, and it was focused mostly online, with smaller rallies. And for all we could say is that the parties in general more or less were trying to comply with the safety regulations, which are actually wearing of masks in the open place, where the physical distance could not be maintained, and wearing them in the closed place at any time. They were trying, actually, as I said, more or less to cope with these regulations, and the work of the relevant institutions were actually both the State Election Commission, which is the highest election management body, and the State Commission for Prevention of Corruption, which is monitoring the misuse of state resources and other violations in that regard, were actually holding sessions online. So it was not, for example, a problem for me as an observer of these bodies to monitor them from home. So it was very convenient for us. In order to accommodate voters which were affected with COVID, election silence was extended for 2 days before election day. Usually it's 1 day, and 2 days before election day, persons who were positive to COVID and persons who were in self-isolation due to having a contact with positive case were actually allowed to vote in their homes, and some 700 people actually used this right out of we now have around 5,000 current cases, and probably several thousand which are in isolation. So approximately 10% from these people approximately use this right. For this type of voting, special election boards were formed, and 3 of the election board members were health workers, and 2 of the other members were from the political parties. Usually it's 3 members for the administration and 2 members for the political parties. So the members from the administration were actually replaced with health workers. And another change which was done is people with chronic illnesses that were subject to relieving measures. For example, they didn't have to go to work, for example. They could work at home. They were also given the right to vote at home, together with the regular voting of ill and disabled persons, which is done 1 day before election day. On election day, another measure was the extension of the election day for 2 hours. Voting was conducted from 7 in the morning until 9 in the evening, and the turnout was around 52%, which is actually 15% lower than usual for parliamentary elections. Usually we have over 65% turnout for the couple last three maybe, or in the 90s where it was even higher. It was in the 70s. So it's 15% lower, which was expected. Everybody expected this turnout around 50%. There were safety regulations for the voting. Electoral board members and observers and all of the present in the polling station were required to wear masks and gloves, while only election board members were required to remove the mask, to change the mask every 4 hours. And the authorities also provided masks for additional masks for voters who will come to the voting place without masks. So in order to be able to receive the mask and to enter the polling station, they were required to disinfect the hands both before the entry and after the exit of the polling station, and of course to maintain the physical distance and to wear the mask. The other requirement was that the number of voters present at the same time in the polling station should not exceed the number of voting booths in the polling station. We also had to, now I'm turning to our work and how we did cope with COVID. We also had to make many arrangements and many modifications. For example, since the middle of March, we were working, everybody was working from home, and only a couple of days or some week before the continuing of the elections, some of the team, which was the essential election monitoring team, the core team, was actually went to the office, but everything was actually, most of the work was done from home and from remotely or whatever. Training for LTOs was conducted from the central office, from the core team to the LTOs online. This is usually a briefing where they are coming to our office, but now this was conducted online. Training for STOs was conducted mostly outdoors where possible. I will show you some pictures now, how it was done. So you see all of them are wearing masks and keeping the physical distance. The process for applying of observers was conducted online also. And here we have our LTOs are actually people who are working for us for many years, and they also have a database of observers who were present on the previous elections. So they try to fill the places both with old and new observers. So both processes were used for recruitment of the observers. We developed forms to assess the compliance with health protocols, both in the election campaign, on the rallies, and during the voting, how the election board members were actually coping or complying with the procedures. 2 days before the election day, all of the people who were present in the premises in the central office of MOST were actually, some 40 people were present, were tested for COVID. All of them were negative. That was a positive thing. And we conducted PVT operation on the election day. So all of the PVT operators were actually located outdoors in the courtyard of the premises. So in the premises were only people from the central office, which were actually working at MOST. We provided also the STOs, the observers at the polling stations, with a COVID pack. They had 2 masks and a pair of gloves and a disinfectant. I think that is the end, and I hope I was too fast to save time for Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Interesting presentation. Just wanted to get back to the question that we received, and I think it applies to several presentations. How did you observe the voting from home? And whoever wants to answer these questions, did you manage to observe the voting from home, and were there additional measure put in place by the electoral administration for home voting for voters that were known to be infected or were suspected of being infected. Whoever wants to answer this question would be.
So I can mention the Polish case. There is no such thing in Poland as homebound voting. So since there isn't any, we did not observe that. However, for people who are in quarantine, there was a special setup where they would register that they want to receive a postal ballot, and a person from the municipality or someone from the post office would bring the basically voting package to the person, and the person would have to cast their vote within the 3 or 5 minutes at home with the post officer waiting to receive the package, simply because the deadline for registration for people in quarantine was very short. It was only 2 days before the election. So this is why the voting was conducted in a way that people would have to vote basically in place and return their packages and their ballots to the post officer. And obviously we were not able to observe that.
Thank you. Yes, Vujo, please.
Yeah, sure. So regarding voting from home, so in Serbia we don't have postal voting, right? So basically the voting from home is the only way for the voters that cannot go to the polling stations to actually exercise their right to vote. So technically it applies to also to people in hospitals, right? But one of the rules is that the polling board committee, which goes from the polling station to the voter, cannot exceed the territory of the polling station. So in practice, this only means that that those voters which are in the hospital, which are in immediate vicinity of the polling stations, could vote in this way. But even if this was the case, hospitals were closed. I mean, to outsiders during the whole epidemic, and in practice we couldn't monitor voting in hospitals, and B would not make our observers go to hospitals to monitor the process. So we are not sure how it went with the hospitals. But regarding voting from home, this was the first year that the Electoral Commission explicitly said that the observers can also monitor voting from home, which meant that the polling board members had to really be informed in advance of this new rule. According to the rules, observers can monitor, but it doesn't oblige the voters to accept the monitor. So we were wondering whether the people will accept the observers, but basically there was no problem there. Regarding the special equipment, of course, all of our monitors and the voting and the polling board committee members had protective equipment, and they also carried protective equipment for the voters at home. In general, we were all able to observe it on a subsample, so we didn't go to all 500 polling stations, but we went to the subsample of 200 polling stations. We also observed voting from home. In general, I think it was important because of the increased numbers which were expected, and because of the very, very high expectations in the public that this will be one of the mechanisms that the elections will be rigged. We thought this was important for the public to actually have reliable information on how this whole process went on. In general, our findings is that the percentage of irregularities was quite similar as to what we observed at the polling stations. We didn't observe exceedingly high number of irregularities in the polling voting from homes. So I hope this covers it. I'm not sure if maybe there is something interesting, something else that I can mention, but please ask and I can give you more details. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Zlatko, Michael, who please want to be the first.
Zlatko, go ahead.
Okay. Should I go first? Okay.
Yeah, please.
It's very difficult. Okay. So as I said, we usually monitor the voting of the ill and disabled persons, which is done one day before election day. But for these elections, actually, because of also the smaller number of observers, we were not able to have many observers for this type of voting, so we couldn't have some comprehensive and representative sample, which will give us data for to assess the voting. But as for the people who were voting, who were positive for COVID and who were in self-isolation, as I said, there were special election boards comprised of 3 health workers and 2 members from the political parties. And in addition to all the other safety measures for wearing masks and disinfection, they also wore this protection how do you say, a coat, you know, as defender of overall body, and they were also required to change this after each voter. So after each voting, they changed this and wore another coat. So this was one of the precautions, and the other precaution was.
Sorry, I have a question. Did they really comply with this from your information, or did they change the?
I cannot say. As I said, we didn't have any observers for this type of voting. We monitored only the voting of the ill and disabled, which are not ill from COVID. So it was done 2 days before the election day, and we didn't have anything because we put the safety of the observers at the first place. So we didn't monitor this. But from all the other election stakeholders, nobody raised any complaints or any remarks about this voting. So I suppose it was done in compliance with the measures. That's it.
Thank you. Michael, please.
Yes, so regarding voting from home, I can share the example of Croatia, where we
maybe you can turn off the video, please, because it's it might work a little bit better.
The possibility to observe this issue in the context of an OSCE or dear election assessment.
Yeah.
So in the elections on 5. So in Croatia, similar to what we understand from Serbia, for example, with the Srita's example before, there are no early voting from home. And in Croatia, this is foreseen in the legal and procedural framework among the possibilities of voting options for persons with disabilities and other people who might be sick and unable to attend the polling station on election day. Now, in this situation, so this voting from home was in the framework for a long time. It was used for a long time, but never a lot. Now, in this situation of COVID-19, this procedure was mentioned and described as one of the avenues to address the COVID-19 situation. There were increasing requests to vote from home, and the election administration put in additional safeguards like the hygienic measures, gloves, masks, and so forth to implement this procedure. For voting from home has gone up. We understand that in some situations where there were COVID-19 hotspots, not all requests could be served. This procedure as such was rather trust-based from the outset. It was rather unregulated. There is no specific ballot box for it. The ballot is transported collected with an envelope before election day. The question arose whether this procedure would be applicable for persons who were diagnosed positive with COVID-19. And there was actually a very interesting controversy because the election administration had initially understood this not being applicable for persons with COVID-19 to protect the election administration and everybody else. No court, a few days before election day, found that the election commission must find a way to adjust this procedure also to enable the electoral participation of persons with COVID-19. So the compromise that was found in that situation was a procedure known from voting for persons with disability, with a trusted assistant came to the person at home, and the electoral committee was met at the doorstep by an assistant of the voter who was not allowed to touch the ballot, but somebody who was voting in behalf of that person. The ballot was transported to the doorstep and back to the polling station. I hope you could hear the story.
Yeah. Unfortunately, some of the parts were lagging a little bit, but I think we got the example. Thank you very much. Before taking another question from the Q&A list, actually, you have two questions. I would have one. So I forgot to mention that we also use the DEAR methodology, both with mixed teams. In long observers in one polling station or mobile teams. So this is our usual methodology. We'll see now how we'll adapt it. And for gathering data, we use an application which is developed by some of our Romanian partners, which is an organization which is called for Romania. So practically, we have data in real time. We can also see during that day we have problems, but we can also get next morning we have we can interpret the data to see which were the problems in which polling stations and so forth. So I understand in Poland you had use such an application, but I would ask the other panelists if this situation affected in some manner the way in which you gather data from observers. Did you already use some kind of application, or did you introduce such practice, or how does this affect the information process, gathering process?
Okay, I will start first.
It's always hard to.
We have PVT observers, as I said, which are reporting for the turnout during the day, and after the closing of the polling station and the counting of the votes, they are reporting the results. So this reporting is always done by phone, so it was not affected at all from the measures. And regarding the other questions from the observing, any other actually the form which is for the assessment of the voting is actually they are collected by the LTOs, and they are actually reported through an online or online application to us. So this process also did not suffer any problems, because after the voting, observers are going to the local to the LTOs, and they are delivering the forms, and actually the LTOs are entering the forms in the file, in the online file. So we received all of the protocols actually until 12 or 1 in the evening were entered in the program. So we didn't have any problems with that.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Maybe I can just
Yeah,
but basically we didn't change much regarding the data processing on the election day. Our observers have an option of filling a web form or sending an SMS. One thing that was different this year is that we had an hourly SMS, basically because we wanted to see how the turnout was changing from hour to hour. We thought that this was important, which put more pressure on the call center. Call center was something that we were discussing whether to keep the call center at their homes or have them at our HQ. But in the end, we decided to have a call center physically located next to our core team because the communication between the legal team and the call center and us that are processing the data had to be constant. Basically, we couldn't work with a remote call center. That's something that we really thought about, but I think it was a good choice to have them physically close. And other than that, we did not change the way that the election day data was flowing.
Okay, thank you. So we have two more questions. Maybe partly was answered. We have two questions from Eric Alvia from NAMFREL. Did government agencies or EMBs require medical or testing certification for poll workers and observers? And the second one was how was counting, canvassing, and tabulation of votes conducted in a transparent manner? How was it observed? So whoever wants, please, Fernanda.
Yeah, I can start. We know that the Organization of American States, for example, they tested their whole delegation before sending the group to the Dominican Republic for the presidential elections of July 5th. So they did have this procedure. Everybody was tested beforehand. Unfortunately, one of the members did get infected. Of course, we cannot tell for sure if it was during the election and the electoral process. It could have been during the trip. Since the incubation period is relatively long, it's very hard to pinpoint exactly when the person was infected. But it is a good practice, right, to make sure that the observers get tested if availability is there. So yeah, definitely, if it's possible, testing the observers before sending them there would be good. And I just like to tackle the other question too on international observation and domestic observation, right? I think that those are connected to, of course, both are very important, but I think we cannot deny the obstacles to international observation right now. ODIHR sent to Serbia a reduced delegation, right, because of COVID-19. We have all the international travel issues. Sometimes, actually, most of the times, like the international observers are a multi-country group. So some of those countries will have different regulations and different restrictions regarding traveling. So of course, logistically, it makes much more difficult for international observers to be deployed right now. So I think that's just one more reason to make sure that the domestic observers are trained and ready to report back and to make the process as transparent as possible.
Thank you. If somebody else wants to answer any of these questions.
Yeah, it was interesting to me. There was no discussion in Serbia of testing either board members or observers. So I'm it's interesting to hear other experiences. But again, this needs to be seen in the light of really complete easing of the measures during the election campaign. And as I said in my introductory remarks, there was simply no talk of the virus during the campaign. So I think this was probably a smart thing to do. It should have happened, but unfortunately, it didn't happen. And I can only follow up on what Fernanda was saying about international observation in Serbia. We really felt the absence of a full-fledged long-term mission, and that also means that more political weight was on the domestic observers. And again, two observations next to CRTA. There was also CESID that did parallel vote tabulation. There was other domestic organizations, but they didn't observe in the same way we did. Hopefully, we'll see, next time a full mission from OSCE, and of course by the other international observation missions.
So in terms of Poland, there were no such requirements either for commission members or for observers. No tests required, just personal protective equipment that was supplied by the municipality. There was one case in Warsaw of an election commission that decided to measure the temperature of the voters upon them entering the polling station. However, this was, basically reported by a voter once they saw it, and the commission was called by the National Election Commission and told to stop filtering voters in such a way. And as I've mentioned before, in general, the election happened with a very limited mention of the pandemic and of the virus. So it wasn't really that much of an issue during this election specifically.
Thank you.
Okay, I will also have to reflect. Yes, even in our country, there were no requirements for polling board members to be tested and for observers. So this was not regulated at all. As for the transparency, I think it was even better because people were actually trying to maintain the distance. So for observers, I suppose it was even better to have a good overview of the counting of the tabulation process. And I suppose the same was also at the municipal level, where the results were tabulated and reported to the State Election Commission. So I think maybe even it was better for the observers to observe this process now.
Okay, thank you. Michael, please.
Yeah, I switch off again. So I like to come back to the question of the type of observation that we are pursuing here. So I think the examples from North Macedonia, Serbia, and Poland show very well the added value of election day observation by citizen observers. And with Sofia's example from Poland, it even shows how the interest in domestic election observation has gone up during that time compared to previous times. And I think that's really interesting. However, we might come to situations where a citizen election observation is not possible for legal or for health reasons or other reasons. And I think we should continue to extend our observations beyond election day for long-term observation during the longer-term electoral cycle. And COVID-19 really affects much more than election day. It affects the campaign, it affects election procedures in the long term, it affects the legislative processes and the legal frameworks. And I think we should continue to observe these dimensions over a longer period and in a comparative manner. And that is also something we would like to do in Europe. And if there are more organizations interested in a project like this, we would be very happy to join forces in that regard, to observe the tensions between the right to vote and the right to protect each other's health for a longer period. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Very good point. And I was saying in the opening of the event, we already started to observe the electoral process, and there are some very challenging steps that will probably have to cover. I don't know, online, or it will be more challenging than usual when you could meet the interlocutors and go to, I don't know, to all kind of meetings or rallies. And I would also like to, because we are almost out of time. I would also like to cover these questions. In Romania, so far, we don't have any kind of special procedures for the election day, apart from what I already told you related to the distribution of masks. But we'll probably have it closer to elections. I hope not too close to elections. But I guess we won't have a legal requirement for testing. In terms of our observers, I think, unfortunately, we will not be able to impose such limitations, especially due to the fact that in Romania, I guess a test is around 60 euros or something like this. So we cannot ask to each observer to have this test. And it also, you have the question, if you don't have it, and if you go take the test, you expose yourself to go into the hospital. So we cannot ask this to our observers. But I don't think that the polling workers and the representatives of the political parties will also be required to. And I don't think it will be provided by the test. Imagine that we have 18,000 polling stations, which is quite a number. So if you multiply with, I don't know, at least 5-member polling station, each of them, it's a lot of people. Related to the counting and tabulation, as I was saying, we have this application which is run by a tablet, on a tablet, and we have an operator in each polling station, and they have to record all the steps. And the tablets are kept by a special institution, which can provide the prosecutors the specific recording if there is, if somebody can prove that there is or can submit a complaint for electoral fraud, and the recordings are kept for 1 year. So practically 1 year from now, you can use this recording. But I would say that taking into consideration the previous experiences, there are not many complaints, or the chance to have a recount or annulation of results, it's almost zero. Also, the tablet, it's used for, it helps commissions to centralize the results. So practically you have a live update of number of voters, and you can also input the results before having the paper protocol in this tablet. And at the end, any user can compare the electronic data with the final printed sheet. So practically you have all kind of informations if you want to compare it at the end. I would say that we are going close to the end of the event. We have one more question, but I think we kind of replied. How did COVID positive people vote? I don't know if somebody else wants to add something to this question. I think but I think you kind of covered it in your interventions. But if there are any further comments, please. Yes, please. Michael. We don't hear you. I think you have your microphone muted.
Yes, sorry. I think on this point, we should just be aware that the right to vote is not taken for granted for all persons with COVID-19 in all countries that we are observing, including in Europe. So in Croatia recently, there was an open question whether the right to vote should be granted for persons with COVID-19, because the protection of persons who would facilitate that vote was also under consideration by the election administration. In the end, in Croatia, there was a compromise found. At the same weekend or the weekend after, in Spain, during local elections in Galicia and in the Basque country, the solution was different. There, COVID-19 patients were not allowed to vote. because there was a health argument put in place. This is my understanding, even I did not follow the processes in Spain in more detail. But I think we should watch that carefully. Yeah, the right to vote is not granted for all people with diseases like this.
Yeah, thank you very much for the good comment. For us, it will be one of the major things that we will follow to make sure that the procedure are in place. Unfortunately, as I was saying, now we are not very the procedure are not very clear, so we'll know more when we get closer to the date of the elections. So I think if there are not any final comments from any of you, we can close the event. I would like to thank you very much. It was a very interesting discussion, and actually I think all of you had very useful stories and advice for us. And I was saying we are also trying to gather a short document with some of the good practice that may help other organizations that will observe elections in the second part of the year or next year, because we are not sure how much this situation will be, but probably will not end in December. And when we have it, we'll send it to all of you. But thank you again for sharing all this information, and congratulations for the work you did, I would say. And if there are any final comments, please, from any of you. Oh, okay. Then thank you very much to you and to our participants, and hope to see you in face-to-face in the near future. Thank you again, and have a lot of good luck with your future steps.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.